You have been telling stories, nonprofit stories, and helping nonprofits tell stories for 25 plus years.
Yes.
That's a long time.
Yeah. It's a
You've
lot of stories.
seen lots of stories, exactly. I don't know if you ever get this question. I get this question a lot. People will ask me, Chris, what is the one story that I should be telling that raises a lot of money? There isn't really just one story. I mean, there's a lot of stories happening at the same time. There's the donor story, which is crucial. You know, what does that donor want to see accomplish, do in that person's life? And then there's the organization story that has to tap into that donor story. Now, when I started, I thought a story, the best kind of story, had a definite middle, and a definite end. But since working with you, and those stories raise a lot of money, told well, those stories raise a lot of money. But since working with you, I have discovered there's a better way of telling a story.
Yes.
And that's kind of an incomplete story. It's a beginning, it's a middle, but there's no end.
Yeah. Or rather, the donor gets to decide the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this story is super applicable when you're asking for money. Not necessarily when you're doing other things in nonprofit donor communications, but when you're asking for money, you want to tell an incomplete story and leave the ending of the story up to the donor. So doing that, and we can talk about what that looks like. But doing that does a couple really powerful things for donors. Number one, it plays into the donor's story, because most donors are telling themselves a story about their life and their giving and their philanthropy. And that story, boiled down to its essence, almost always includes helping people who need help or helping causes that they care about that need help. And so if you tell an incomplete story that is not yet finished, you have just played into the donor's story. You have just said what she needs to hear for her to want to help you. That's just a really big part of telling, as nonprofits tell stories in fundraising, is to make sure you're playing into the donor's story and giving her something to help, some powerful role to play, because she would rather help someone than to be your partner.
It's almost like a bunch of years back, there's the tsunami over in Asia.
Yep.
And so much money flooded to the Salvation Army, to lots of different organizations that had a need.
Yep.
Right? Because it was an incomplete story. People wanted to help those people out.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right. And I mean, to kind of break that apart a little bit, there was this big incident. A whole lot of people's lives were in question. We did not know how their story would end. And it was clear that donors could help make their stories end better.
Right.
And that's why disaster fundraising works so well. It's one of the reasons anyway. But you can apply that principle to raising money for a food bank or a school or an arts organization, of telling an incomplete story where the end of the story is not yet finished.
So how does that play out? Because you can't count on disasters, nor do you want to count on disasters.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And, so how does just the regular nonprofit doing good every single day apply that to what they're doing?
Yeah, so great question. And the answer in a nutshell is for nonprofits to narrow their focus. And what I mean by that is not talk about all your programs and your vision and your mission and everything that you do over time, and instead talk about some small identifiable part that takes a certain amount of time that's happening now. So let me give you an example. Say you're an organization that's fighting illiteracy in your town. Most nonprofits would say, hey, we helped a whole lot of people learn how to read. Will you partner with us by sending in a gift today to help more people in the future how to read? That is a completed story.
I've seen that many, many times.
Yeah. I just as an aside, I think that's the classic nonprofit appeal letter model. We helped somebody. Here's how we did it. Will you partner with us in the future? What you want to do is tell an incomplete story. So go find something that's happening now. And so say, instead of asking donors to end illiteracy in your town, say, hey, we are running 3 reading classes for junior hires this summer. Will you please give a gift so that you will help each of these junior high kids learn to read before the end of the summer so that they're ready to read when they go back to school. So we've narrowed our focus from the whole vision and mission and programs of the organization down to a thing that is happening now and that is not yet done. So the donor has a powerful role to play, and so she has a reason to give today.
Just thinking about that, I mean, that is so much more compelling.
Yeah. Yeah, it works like crazy. It goes against a couple of organizational values. You want to tell complete stories because it feels like that shows donors that you're good with their money and that you can manage your programs and all that stuff. And it's hard to ask for help now because that requires vulnerability, which is in short supply at some organizations. They want to be perceived as, hey, we've got all this taken care of. But the negative consequence of that is it sounds to donors like you're taking care of everybody. Everything is going great here. We don't really need your gift, but it'd be nice if you gave one.
But as a donor, I'd say, okay, great. You guys are doing wonderful, wonderful work.
Yep.
Kudos to you.
Yep.
I'll go fund this organization over here.
Yeah, because in your donor's mailbox or on her phone or in her inbox are loads of other organizations asking. And the really savvy ones have figured out a way to work urgency into every time they ask. Because the sort of growing and large organizations have figured out that they have their core donors who will give to them basically no matter what. And that's totally happening for small organizations. But there's a whole bunch of other people on the periphery who care about your organization or your cause a little bit. And if you don't give those people a compelling reason to give today, right now, the chances of those people giving to you is just really slim. So you want to build in these incomplete stories, these powerful roles for donors to play into basically every single time you're asking for money.
I can see some people giving you pushback on that whole incomplete story thing. It's going to make people uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, it's a double whammy. It makes two sets of people uncomfortable. It makes the nonprofit uncomfortable because they feel like they're not doing their job by sort of leaving the donor hanging or telling the donor that they've helped people they've met. So that makes the people in the organization uncomfortable. And it makes some donors uncomfortable because they see really clearly that some of the responsibility for what happens is on their shoulders. Some donors will see that responsibility and give. Because remember, the story that they're telling themselves is they help people in need. And frankly, that's the vast majority of respondents. But some donors will see that responsibility and complain because it makes them feel uncomfortable. They don't like being on the hook. There are some people who just don't respond well to that. But I can tell you from experience that most of the people who complain, and I mean the vast, vast, vast majority of people who complain, are lower value donors. And I mean that purely in monetary terms. They just aren't giving that much for that long. For whatever reason, that's the way it is. But my basic belief is that the people who are core, they already know that they have some of that responsibility. And a good incomplete story just reminds them of that. And they say, oh yeah, I do care about this. I want to help. And results go up.
Well, I think too, just thinking about that one particular story is being short-sighted. Because if you tell an incomplete story,
Yep.
and the donor says, all right, let me step up for this,
Yep.
that gives you an opportunity then to complete that story.
Yep.
So the donor feels doubly as good. Hey, you know what?
Yep.
My gift did make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can go into another
Yep.
incomplete story.
Yeah. Well,
So you're constantly closing that loop.
No, that's exactly right. And that gets into what we teach about asking, thanking, and reporting. When you're asking for money, that's when you should be telling these incomplete stories. But when you're reporting, that's when you tell complete stories and you give credit to the donor for completing the story because she did via her previous giving. And then once you have proven to her that she completes stories with her gifts and that you give her the credit and joy for doing so, the next time you give her an incomplete story, she is so much more likely to say yes. Because you've just sort of you've closed the loop. You've built that circle of trust. It's a virtuous circle where you give her chances to complete stories, and then when she does, you give her credit for doing so. How much more is she going to trust you than the organization down the street who is just always saying, hey, everything is great, will you partner with us? Hey, everything is great, will you be a supporter? It just works better, both in the short term and in the long term, in terms of building long-term donor relationships.
So the takeaway is, don't finish your story. Let the donor see themselves completing the story for you.
Yep, that's right. And the sort of final note in this thing that we're building is to have a current need, to be asking about a current need that exists today. The other thing that you take from that sort of the classic nonprofit appeal letter approach that we talked about earlier is it's asking for helping people in the future. They do not mention that anybody needs help today. You want to be asking about people or a place or a thing or a cause that needs help today. That's just another way to add urgency into it so the donor sees that, hey, there are real consequences to inaction. There are consequences to giving and to not giving. And that's where she gets to complete the story. She gets to decide. And I think that is that's a complex but true form of donor love, where we're giving people in our world the ability to decide how this world is going to be. So tell incomplete stories so that she knows she has a powerful role to play, and have a current need in all of your stories when you're asking for money so that she knows there's a reason to give today, and you'll raise a lot of money.